So thank you very much. It is an honor to be here. My name is Elizabeth Long. As Catherine mentioned, I am a behavioral designer, and my focus is very much on behavioral change. So again, thank you very much to be here. It is such an honor to be in this session and to have gotten to listen to all of the very fascinating conversations so far today, and to have gotten to be a part of them, and also to be in absolutely beautiful Morocco. I know it's a beautiful day outside, so thank you everyone for coming back from the break, and hopefully this will be a really fascinating session for everyone. So this should be a sorry, technical difficulties. Here. Okay, sorry about that. So this should be an interesting session. So I've been asked to kick off with an incredibly brief overview of behavior change. Now, about 20 minutes is no ways near long enough to talk about behavior change. So I encourage all of you to come speak with me afterwards. And I'd love to give you more information on behavior change and talk with you more and bore you to death on behavior change. But hopefully for the next 20 minutes, we won't bore you. Now, so I'm going to talk with you a little bit about behavior change, but also about behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is a really interesting tool to understand the realities of human behavior. And what's important about understanding the realities of human behavior is that it allows us to design better programs. And we want to be able to design better programs so that we can have real and sustained lasting behavior change, particularly around this crucial issue of antibiotic use. So, whenever we think about behavior change, one of the most important key elements to think about is what is the actual behavior that we want to think about? So this sounds like a really easy thing to do. What behavior do we want to change? And in this case, it might be use antibiotics correctly or use antimicrobials correctly. But this maybe isn't actually the best way to phrase this. What does the word use mean? And what does the word correctly mean? So we need to think about a different way of phrasing this, because is this actually a behavior? And who are we talking to? Are we talking to veterinarians? Are we talking to pharmacists? Are we talking to other distributors of antimicrobials? Or are we talking to farmers? And if we're talking to farmers, are we talking to small-scale farmers? Are we talking to large-scale farmers? Are we talking to individuals who have, 3 or 4 or 5 chickens? Or are we talking to individuals who have whole herds of cattle? All of this matters when we're talking about behavior change. So when we're thinking about designing behavior change programs, we have to know what behavior we're wanting to change and who we're talking to. Not only that, we have to think about the context in which we want them to change the behavior. So we have to ask ourselves questions. Who is the actor? As I just mentioned, is it a veterinarian? Is it a pharmacist? Is it another distributor or seller? Where are they doing the behavior? Is it at home? Is it in a marketplace? Is it in a veterinarian clinic? Is it somewhere else? Is it on a formal market? Is it on the black market? Is this an individual who's going to a market and they're doing many, many other things that day? Is this a farmer who's going to the market to buy some antibiotics for his chickens, but in the course of that day, he's also buying drugs for one of his sick children? Maybe he's buying anti-malarial drugs for one of his children. Maybe he's also buying food for his family. Maybe he's also buying some seed to plant new crops. Maybe he's also buying some other food for his animals. Maybe he's also buying some new household goods. And he has to accomplish all of these tasks during the day and still get home when it's light out. So his purchase of antimicrobials that day is just a small portion of what he's doing that day. And we're expecting him to make this very complicated decision. And we're expecting him to think about something as important as antibiotic safety and resistance and which drug he's going to buy and how he's going to use it effectively, all in the context of all these other decisions he's making that day. And that can be a lot. So when we're thinking about behavior change, we really need to think about the context in which people are making decisions and the context in which people are taking actions. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about the context later, but first I'm going to give you what I hope is a fun example. Now, so I don't know if any of you in here are radiologists, but this is an MRI. Now, does anyone in here notice anything kind of weird or odd about this MRI? So it's an MRI of a human's spinal cord. I'll give you all a couple seconds to look at it. Does anyone notice anything weird? There's something not right in this MRI. Does anyone see what it is? Yeah, there's something funny about it. Now, if you can't see it now, there's actually a gorilla, okay, and the gorilla's kind of waving at you. Now, this is weird. Why would there be a gorilla in an MRI? Okay, you kind of think, this is a little funny. But this was a test. This was an experiment that was done with radiologists, with highly trained radiologists. 83% of the radiologists who were given this image did not see this gorilla. And you think, wow, those radiologists were really bad at their job. Think, wow, they shouldn't have been radiologists. But no, these were highly trained radiologists who were highly skilled at their job. What we call this is actually inattention blindness, okay? This is actually what we call a cognitive bias, okay? And this is a form of what we call behavioral economics. It's a cognitive bias. This is a reality of the human brain. So this is a very fancy way of saying when you're so focused on looking for one thing, sometimes you might miss other things. So in this case, what's happening is radiologists who read MRIs, they're so focused for looking for tumors. Their attention is looking for the edges of tumors. That's what they're skilled at looking at. And because they're looking for tumors, they don't see gorillas. Because they don't look, this gorilla that's waving at them doesn't look like a tumor. So they're so focused for looking for tumors that they're not seeing the gorilla. Okay, and that is a cognitive bias that these radiologists have. It's a normal human cognitive bias. So think about a farmer. A farmer is quite possibly very focused on figuring out how to keep his family alive. He's so focused on figuring out how to keep his family alive that it's entirely possible that he's not focused on thinking about antibiotic resistance in his chickens, okay? And that's not a fault of the farmer. It's very possibly a human cognitive bias. Radiologists have this human cognitive bias. Farmers can very possibly exhibit the same cognitive bias. It's not a fault, it's simply human behavior. And this is what behavioral economics shows us, that humans have these behavioral and cognitive biases that affect how we think and that affect how we make decisions. And that's what behavioral economics does. It kind of flips our traditional view of decision-making and our traditional view of behavior change. So our traditional view of behavior change is based on this idea that if you give someone information, that information makes them want to do something. If you tell someone that something is good for them, then they want to do it, and then that leads to them doing something. It's this very linear process. If you tell me to eat vegetables because vegetables will help me grow strong, then I kind of want to eat vegetables, and then I'm going to do vegetables. Then I'm going to eat vegetables, and then I'm going to grow strong. We all know that that's not really the case, that doesn't work. But we still design policies that way. We designed so many of our policies assuming that if we just give out information, it means that there will be behavior change. And think about this. Think about all of the communication policies we have out there, 90% of those programs are let's give people information and let's assume that people will follow that information and there'll be behavior change. But let's think about my life. I'm not going to assume that you aren't perfect people, but I'm going to assume for the moment that I'm not a perfect person. So sometimes people give me information. They send me emails, or say they give me a brochure. And that email sits in my inbox. I read the beginning of the email and I think, you know, I don't have time to read the rest of this email right now. So I'm gonna read it later. And that's a case where I receive the information, but I just don't have time to think about that information right there. So I get the information, but it never moves to that intention phase. So there's this, it stops. It doesn't ever move anywhere else past that intention phase. And that's a fault for me, but maybe you guys also have emails sitting in your inboxes that don't get read. And maybe you know of cases when, you know, perhaps you've gone to the doctor's office, or other cases where someone hands you a pamphlet and you think, oh, okay, I'm gonna read this when I get home. You put it in your bag, you think, oh, I'm gonna read this on the plane. You put it in your bag, and then, you know, you end up recycling it without ever having looked at it, okay? This happens to farmers as well. People give them information on antibiotics. Chances are they may not read the information, okay? This happens in real life. It's also possible that you do end up reading, you do end up absorbing information, but what ends up happening next? Sometimes that information is overwhelming. A lot of times with health information in particular, thinking about information about health is daunting. It's confusing, it's overwhelming. You think, you know, I wanna go think about getting, you know, screened for cancer, but my gosh, it's complicated. I don't really wanna think about it. I don't know where to start. So we kind of just put off doing it. You want to do it, but you just think about delaying actually starting to do the decision. We actually call that ostriching. Like the animal, the ostrich, who puts its head in the sand. That's the technical term for what humans do when they don't want to think about doing a behavior. Or, I don't know if any of you have done this, but I've definitely done this. You think, I'm going to get healthy. I'm going to start a diet next Monday. Next week, I'm going to start a diet. Has anyone ever thought that? You know, I'm going to start exercising next Monday. And then next week, you think, I'm going to start exercising next week. And then next week, you think, I'm going to start exercising next week. Okay, and that also happens. You have this intention to do something, but it just stays an intention. You never really end up moving it forward. And that's called deferral. This is normal human behavior. But we forget that humans do this when we design programs. Now, sometimes we actually do move forward and we start an action. But sometimes we don't always finish the action. We might start to sign up for a program. You know, you're filling out a form, and you start filling out a form, and you get partway through, and you realize you need another piece of information that isn't right there. And you need to go look it up, or you need to ask someone else that information, and that person isn't reachable at that moment. So you think, okay, I'll ask them when they get home, I'll call them later. So you put the form aside. And then somehow something gets put on top of that form, and a month later you find that form again and you think, oh, I never finished filling out. I never finished registering for this. And maybe you missed the deadline, or maybe at that point you think, oh, I should do this again. And you think, oh, I should call that person. I'll do it later. Okay? All of these things are normal human behavior, but we always forget that when we design programs. And they're not flaws in human behavior. They are behavioral and cognitive biases that get in the way of us following through on our behavior. And sometimes we do end up actually following through on our actions, and we do end up getting to an outcome. So when we're thinking of people following through on behaviors around using antibiotics responsibly, there's all these different things that can get in the way of them using antibiotics responsibly. And we need to think through all of these different reasons in the different contexts. And none of these, and this is crucial, none of these deal with blame. And none of these deal with, well, they're not motivated enough, or they don't necessarily have enough information. So, this is what behavioral economics teaches us, which is why it's really crucial. Because frequently, when we start with a base of, well, it's just information that's lacking, then we kind of get into this cycle of, well, people just need more information. And that ends up creating these programs that, unfortunately, I think in the past have not been as successful as they could be. And they're a crucial place to start. And I think in some fields, they've been very successful, but now we need to start digging deeper and figuring out deeper ways to really start to crack the surface of antimicrobial resistance issues. So, just an overview of behavioral economics and what we've talked about is the brain is more like a muscle than a computer. And so we think of the brain and we think of the fact that, the brain really needs to be replenished. We need to take a break and we need to take a step back. And we all know this from work. You can't just work efficiently for 8 hours. You need to take a rest. You need to give your brain time to reflect. We value the present more than we value the future. We want rewards now more than we want rewards in the future. We make different choices based on our emotional state. When we're hungry or when we're angry, we make different choices than when we're calm. And this is something to consider. And this is something particularly important in low-income settings during times of particularly famine, when you're in a situation where you're living in scarcity, you're making very different decisions when you're living in situations of scarcity than when you're not. We are strongly influenced by what we see other people doing. And this is marketing 101. If you see someone else buying something, that is very much an influencer for what we see other people doing. If you see your neighbor buying antibiotics, that can be a very strong influencer for what you're doing. Even if you hear someone else telling you not to use antibiotics, well, your neighbor's doing it, so it must be okay because your neighbor's a good person. That's kind of the logic that you can go through in your head of, even if someone else is telling you that you shouldn't be doing it, well, if your neighbor's doing it and he's a good person, then why shouldn't I? That type of logic is incredibly powerful, and that's very normal human behavioral logic. So why is behavioral economics thinking important? So it's crucially important because it moves us past this thinking about just communication. Communication programs are crucially important, and they're a crucial first step. But as a second step, behavioral economics thinking helps us expand the types of programs and the types of interventions that we can design as part of our policy programs. So instead of thinking of just information programs, it allows us to expand our designs. So I'll give you one example of a program, and unfortunately there aren't a lot of good examples in the area of antimicrobials, particularly in the field of animal health. So this is an example of fertilizer in Kenya, and the traditional thinking around behavior change is that the hypothesis is that farmers weren't using fertilizer because they didn't understand the benefits. So if you work from the assumption that farmers don't understand the benefits of something, then you design a program just to give them information. Or the second hypothesis is that farmers couldn't afford the fertilizer. And if you assume that they can't afford fertilizer, then you design a program around subsidies to make it cheaper for them so that they can afford the fertilizer. So they did this program, and if you look at the control, which was just the information, you found that 24% of farmers used fertilizer with just the information, and 37% of farmers used fertilizer if it was heavily subsidized. Now, the researchers decided, well, maybe it was a little more complicated than that. What if we applied behavioral economics thinking to this? And what if we said, maybe it was this gap between intentions and actions? Maybe farmers had the intention to use fertilizer, maybe they knew the benefits, but they were just getting caught up in actually moving from that intention to action. And so maybe they assumed that it was the fact that farmers wanted to use fertilizer, but using fertilizer had a lot of complicated steps. If you think about using fertilizer, it's something that you have to put on your plants at a time when you don't usually have a lot of money, because you have to put it on a time right before when your plant is growing, which is when you have the least amount of money, because you have the most amount of money at your previous harvest. And if you think about your income, at that point, you've used up the majority of your income from your previous harvest. So in order to buy fertilizer, you have to save almost all year, and you have to keep that savings. So what they did was they designed a plan where you could basically plan to buy fertilizer right after your harvest, and then it would be delivered at the right time. And that eliminated all of the hassles and sort of all of the planning and all of the savings. And it made it mentally very easy for farmers to invest in this plan. And so that was their design. And what they found was that this simple redesign of the program, 38% of farmers would use fertilizer just by making it hassle-free to use this program. The same amount as if it was heavily subsidized. And you think, wow, it wasn't that the farmers couldn't afford it, and it wasn't that they didn't want to use it. It was simply the fact that it was all these hassles were getting in the way. And so what they did the second year of the program, instead of providing the subsidy, they eliminated the subsidy, because subsidies are great, but subsidies cost a lot of money and they're not sustainable. So the second year of the program, the government decided to cut the subsidy, and just this behavioral program, this redesigned program, 44% of the farmers used the fertilizer. So making it easier for farmers to purchase the fertilizer meant that close to half of them purchased and used it. So it was really just this intention gap. And you can see the communication alone, just the normal program, was still at the 26%. So this idea that it wasn't this lack of information, it wasn't this lack of motivation per se, it was really just the fact that, you know, there was all these hassles associated with it, and they needed a program that worked within their lives, and it made it easy for them to use the fertilizer. So, almost finished talking. Now, when you're designing programs, the most important thing is to focus on the behavior that you want someone to do. And you have to remember that it's not about motivation, and it's not necessarily just about information. Information is always a key first element, but you always have to then think a little deeper. Intention only sometimes leads to action. So I want to challenge you guys over the next couple of days to think about what behaviors people in your programs and in your situations are doing. All of you are either working on or helping design programs. And so what are the assumptions that your programs are making? And you may be working at sort of the more senior level, or you may be working at kind of a lower level where you're working with farmers or with veterinarians or, you know, with distributors. And what assumptions are you making about their behavior? Are you assuming that they have knowledge? Are you assuming that they have the ability to, like, to act and what their actual context is. So come talk to me about those programs and the assumptions you're making. And we can start to think about how you can design those programs. And sometimes it's just really small tweaks to the programs. So yeah, come talk to me and just keep thinking about specific behaviors.
Merci, Elisabeth.